Good afternoon and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless of the method, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking a question. Our speaker's prepared remarks will last about 45 minutes, and then we'll take 10 or 15 minutes of questions and end at about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, as I mentioned at the top of the introduction, we do have a social media channel, and this talk is being recorded for that. It will be posted shortly thereafter to the YouTube channel. To access it, there's the icon at the top of the website. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker, and someone I'm thrilled to have. I reached out to him many months ago to get him to speak, and he graciously agreed. Kevin Passmore is professor of history at Cardiff University. He is the author of Fascism, A Very Short Introduction, The Right in France, From the Third Republic to Vichy, and From Liberalism to Fascism, The Right in a French Province, 1928 to 1939. He's also spent more than 30 years at Cardiff and is an extremely well-regarded historian, as you'll soon realize. Today, he's going to discuss his latest book, The Maginot Line, A New History, which explores the political, social, and cultural dimensions of interwar French defense policy to understand why the Maginot Line was built, how it was configured, and its role in shaping France's 1940 defeat. Not surprisingly, the reviews have been top shelf. Jeremy Black, in his excellent new book, Kevin Passmore confronts both his specific topic and more general approaches and does so with skill, aplomb, and consequence. While Lawrence Friedman in Foreign Affairs write, Passmore's magisterial revisionist account of the Maginot Line challenges the conventional understanding of its role in World War II. There are many other reviews like that. I would know the book was cited as a Critic Book of the Year 2025. And with that, I will turn it over to Kevin.
Thanks, Greg, for that generous introduction and for giving me this great opportunity to present my book. Now, we're all familiar with the myth of the Maginot Line, that the French, or rather the Allied army, lost because it sat complacently behind supposedly impregnable fortifications on the German and Luxembourg borders. These were the great forts, perhaps some of you have visited them, with crews from anything from company to battalion size, with their underground hospitals, command posts, barracks, telephone exchanges, narrow gauge railway lines, power plants, and multiple fighting blocks at the surface. A law of 1930 funded two great fortified regions on the German border, which you can see in the red circle there, at Metz and on the Lauter. The Rhine under that law, which is just below the red circle, that was defended by machine gun casements. There were also fortifications in the Alpine passes and defending Nice. I see that on my screen at least, I think it's okay now actually, but on the previous slide, the bottom of the slide was cut off. Another law of 1934 fortified a few key points further north on the Belgian border above the red oval. Now, as the myth goes, the fortifications were outflanked by a daring blitzkrieg attack further north through Belgium, more particularly through the allegedly impenetrable Ardennes forest, where the French had constructed only light fortifications. The lighter fortifications are the light grey lines on the map, the thin grey lines on the French side. But according to the myth, this was much more than just a military error. The Maginot Line supposedly lulled the French people into a false sense of security because the trauma of war had sapped the national will and made the country decadent. Specialists have long since countered this myth, arguing that fortification was actually a rational policy in very difficult circumstances where the French had very few options. And instead, historians really these days focus on the mistakes of the generals. Now, I don't broadly disagree with these accounts. So why write a book about the Maginot Line? First, and probably least important, I do think that the current focus on the mistakes of generals in the decisive battles in Belgium and the Netherlands has meant unjustified neglects of the fortifications' role in the defeat, which we'll come to in a moment. Secondly, I want to shift the object of inquiry away from why the French lost, on which we're pretty clear, to why they took the decisions they did. Now, that requires abandoning the usual contrast between a passive and defensive French doctrine and German aggressive tactics and strategy. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, there's a third reason for writing a book about the Maginot Line, which is that it's a compelling human story. Half of France's 2 million frontline soldiers served on it. Famous Frenchmen who served there include two presidents, Charles de Gaulle and François Mitterrand, the composer Olivier Messiaen in the middle, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre on the right. It was also one of the greatest engineering projects of the age, and you can see one of its entrance blocks there with a narrow gauge railway leading straight into it. It's equivalent on scale and social and impact to the Hoover Dam, for instance, which is contemporaneous. The Maginot Line was part of a huge complex of new barracks for troops, garden cities for officers, military roads, narrow gauge railways, command posts, planned floodings, thousands of miles of electrical and telephone cables, barbed wire, anti-tank rails, and supply chains reaching across the French Empire and around the world. Now, finally, as a historian, I've always been interested in the idea of taking an object and studying it from different perspectives, often from the perspective of different disciplines. Now, as it happens, this is a method that originated with a great French social historian called Marc Bloch. Now, Bloch fought in both world wars and served briefly on the Maginot Line. He was ultimately tortured and executed by the Germans for his resistance activity. As a child of war, Bloch likened this method, the historical method, to a searchlight shining on an enemy aircraft, illuminating it from different angles and giving a complete picture. Now, nobody these days would think it profitable to provide a total picture of anything in the past, still less an objective one. So my own book includes perspectives that he pioneered, such as ecological history, the impact of fortification on the border population, but others that he would not have thought of, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I'm not going to cover all of this in 45 minutes. So what I'm going to do is give a flavor of the sorts of things that are in the book by going back over the first question, the reasons for defeat, but especially the second question, why they took decisions they did, why did the French lose, why did they take the decisions, and what the role of the Maginot Line was in those decisions, which I think is neglected. So let's begin by reminding ourselves of the sequences of the battle in May and June 1940. The French, the Allies, never intended to remain behind their fortifications, which you can see, I think you can see my cursor along there. On the contrary, the purpose of the Maginot Line was to seal the German and Italian frontiers so that the Germans would be forced to invade through Belgium. And the little town of Longuyon, which is marked on the map, I don't know if you can see it, was deliberately chosen as the western limit of the fortifications because if the Germans outflanked them, they would necessarily violate Belgian territory, where the French planned to meet them. If things went badly in Belgium, they had fortifications, light fortifications to fall back on, but that was all. Now, meeting the Germans in Belgium had the advantage of keeping the fighting off French soil, but above all, of ensuring that the British would intervene, as they had in 1914. And at the time of construction, that was not certain. The only question was where to fight in Belgium. Just across the border on the Escaut, as Marshal Pétain, First World War general and head of the collaborationist Vichy government in the Second World War, he advocated that. Deeper into Belgium on the so-called River Dial line, or as far as the Netherlands up to Breda, which you can see on the top left of that. Now, Gamelin adopted the French commander adopted an ambitious option. On news of the German offensive, he ordered armoured and motorised forces into central Belgium on the plains, but also to Breda in the Netherlands, 200 kilometres from French bases, in an armoured and motorised manoeuvre. Now, the expectation was that the Germans' main attack would come through central and northern Belgium. They did send forces there. The French halted the two panzer divisions there in two great battles. But they had entered a trap. The Germans quickly broke through further south on the Meuse River in Belgium and France, notably at Sedan, which you can see on the very bottom of that sweeping arrow. The Germans won, the consensus is, because they took advantage of the intrinsic weakness of initial defence. They concentrated overwhelming force at weak points on strung out French lines, rather like D-Day, in fact. Once they broke through, the Germans faced very little opposition as they sped to the Channel. The Allies were unable to concentrate for counterattack. The fatal error was to have sent the mobile reserve to the Netherlands, to Breda, thus depriving the French of a strategic and mobile reserve with which to counterattack. Now, I don't disagree with that account of the defeat, but I do think that in its enthusiasm to refute the old idea that the Maginot Line was a symbol of French decadence, the Maginot Line has rather been put out of the picture. So in that story I've just told, it hardly figures. But in fact, I think the fortifications did play quite a considerable part in the defeat, and we'll see more so in the decision to go to Breda. One reason is that the fortifications were massively overmanned. As the Germans invaded, nearly half of France's 2 million frontline troops were stationed behind it, thus reducing further the availability of reserves to counter a German breakthrough. The map shows just how many divisions there were there. Furthermore, many of these divisions, some of the best equipped, were immobile fortification troops. Another reason why the Maginot Line matters is that the commander of the Second Army, which was headquartered up in the top left of my map there, it actually had its front at Sedan, where the Germans broke through. Now, Hunziker was ordered to attack the flanks of the Germans as they advanced, but in fact, he moved south and lined up to defend the Maginot Line and ended up doing very little. Now, that brings me then to the second purpose of the book, which is to shift the object of research away from simply why the French lost to why they took these decisions. Now, from the account that I've just given you, it means that we have to explain both the weight of the Maginot Line and the reckless, albeit daring if it had succeeded, advance to the Netherlands. Why, if the French were so committed to passive defence behind the fortifications, did Gamelin's plan require armoured units to beat the enemy to objectives 200 kilometres from their own lines and only 100 kilometres from German bases? This plan so contrasts with the supposed caution of French doctrine that historians have struggled to explain it, and it's even been suggested that Gamelin's mind was clouded by secondary syphilis. For me, the answer is simply to abandon the conventional contrast between ponderous French doctrine, supposedly emphasizing simply command from above, defense, attrition, and careful movement, and German methods which emphasize speed, maneuver, blitzkrieg, and the doctrine of Auftragstaktik, in which the initiative rested with commanders at all levels, from the top down to simple soldiers. Now, this distinction has apparent confirmation by the decisive battle on the Meuse at Sedan, where, absolutely undoubtedly, the best trained German troops faced the least trained French divisions. But if we want to tell the story of the French army in a more general sense, that explains the defeat, but it but the contrast doesn't hold entirely for the two armies, because both armies varied enormously in quality. Thanks to the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, many German soldiers were barely trained. That showed in the second phase of the battle on the Aisne and the Somme in early June, when the French performed much better and the Germans' tactics were much cruder. And this was despite the odds being overwhelmingly against the French. Secondly, a key argument of this book is that in both armies, doctrine was a matter of politicized power struggles. Now, this is quite well known now for German plans for the invasion of France. It's now known that it wasn't pre-planned, Blitzkrieg wasn't pre-programmed, but it was the outcome of politicized conflicts within the army high command. Likewise, the French advance into the Netherlands was the result of a power struggle at the highest level between Gamelin, the commander, who had always favoured manoeuvre and ambitious strategies, and his more cautious deputy, General Georges. Furthermore, and this is another key point of my book, this was no mere personal quarrel, although it was partly that. We'll see that debate about fortification, even dislike of fortification, extended through the army as a whole, as we will see as we progress. Now, what I'm going to do now is to give a kind of overview of the history of fortifications in this light. It's a history of controversy. Now, let's begin with the legacy of the last war, because it's sometimes said that the French attempted to refight the last war, while the Germans fought the next. In fact, the First World War's lessons were endlessly disputed in France during and afterwards, along with the question of whether rapidly evolving post-war technologies, especially from the late 1920s, had fundamentally changed warfare. Now, the war itself bequeathed two very contradictory ideas of fortification. Initially, permanent fortification appeared to be irrelevant. Permanent French fortifications, huge structures at Liège and Maubeuge in Belgium and France, respectively, did not prevent the Germans approaching Paris. Rather, increasingly elaborate trench systems seemingly provided the only protection against machine guns and rapid-fire artillery, but also to enable sucking forwards prior to an attack. In 1916, the Germans easily captured Douaumont Fort in the top right, one of the satellites in the huge Verdun complex. Yet the complex as a whole held out. Now, after the war, there were controversies about whether Verdun had proven that permanent fortification was worthwhile, or whether it had survived only because it was one element in a continuous entrenched front. Another issue was that permanent fortification was unpopular with the troops. Reverberations of artillery shook men's guts and knocked dust and lumps off the walls inside, thus damaging morale. Sanitary conditions were indescribably bad, as I describe some of them in the book. But during their brief occupation of the Douaumont factory, the Germans installed electricity, oxygen machines, sick bays, and an officer's mess. When they recaptured it, the French further modernized it. They dug long galleries to the rear so that the troops could leave during bombardment. Now, that particularly prefigured the Maginot Line. But we should note that the design was both French and German. The future Marshal Philippe Pétain made his name as defender of Verdun, and his name was forever associated with it. But Pétain, contrary to myth again, never liked permanent fortification, and during the war was actually known for an alternative defensive doctrine, which is familiar to students of military history, echeloned or deep field defences. Now, he had learned that, in fact, from German success in defeating French offensives. French artillery preparation and following infantry usually overran lightly held German front lines, but then they had to begin a new preparation and assault to take a second line that was some kilometres further back. So Pétain's own method, therefore, was to wear the enemy Germans down in successive defences and then take the offensive when the enemy was sufficiently weakened. His methods were contested. Many officers resented the idea of surrendering land that had been held at such cost, and this would be important in the Maginot Line. Others rejected the offensive altogether. The attraction to defense to offensive warfare never disappeared in interwar France. Now, the second great issue inherited from the war was command. At the beginning of the war, the conventional wisdom was that soldiers would only fight if they feared the officers more than the enemy. And that seemed to be even more important because the dominant doctrine of all-out attack meant rushing the enemy one pace apart, spurning the use of cover. But it soon became obvious that dispersal and camouflage were necessary, that units should be divided into small tactical groups commanded by junior officers and sergeants. Now, André Maginot, already a member of the French Parliament, was one such sergeant. He formed a reconnaissance group from local daredevils and poachers and was soon seriously wounded in the course of a raid, and he forever walked with sticks. He knew only the war of manoeuvre of 1914. He never had a marked interest in fortification or entrenchment. Only politics and circumstances attached his name to the fortifications, but that's not today's story. The point is that the High Command feared that devolved tactics placed command in the hands of junior officers and uneducated NCOs, and that resonated again in the Maginot Line. All the more so because heavy losses meant that by 1916, active officers, professional officers, had been largely replaced by reserve officers and officers promoted from the ranks. This democratization was permanent. The proportion of officers promoted from the ranks rose from 4% in 1913 to 24% in 1929. Now, professionals always doubted reserve officers' ability to command. So, traditional command also seemed under threat because in 1917, after the failure of the latest offensives, a number of units mutinied, many of them in fact. They did so against the background of revolution in Russia, strikes in the war industries in the interior. Now, mutineers weren't necessarily against the war in principle, but they did oppose murderous, pointless offensives. The point is that this was a conscript army in which soldiers saw themselves as citizens of democratic republic doing their duty and therefore entitled to respect and decent treatment. Now, all these developments, tactical devolution and democratization, conflicted with another quite contrary wartime innovation, which also shaped the Maginot Line. To administer, supply, and maneuver vast armies in a long attritional war, the General Staff turned to industrial management methods known as the sciences of organization, which emphasized central control. Notably, they turned to the system of now forgotten management scientist Henri Fayol, who advocated concentrating powers in the hands of a single manager, but he called him a leader because the word was popular at the time, who transmitted orders downwards. He also used the system. They also used the system of the American engineer Frederick Winslow Taylor, who's associated with rationalization and time and motion studies, in which workers perform simple repetitive tasks. Now, applied to the army, these methods left absolutely no room for initiative on the part of those at the bottom of the hierarchy. It was the antithesis of tactical devolution. Now, it's usually argued that after the war, French doctrine was entirely based on control from above, supposedly incarnated in the notorious field manual, the provisional instruction for the tactical employment of large units of 1921. And it's often contrasted with German Auftragstaktik and the German manuals of the 1930s. But I would argue that these regulations were a compromise and not entirely coherent. They're a product of debate. They actually did formalize tactical devolution by establishing 11-man combat groups within platoons, but they subject them, on the other hand, to strict rules to prevent improvisation. Now, these regulations always remained a subject of controversy, and they were rejected in some parts of the army, in fact. Now, the point today is that this controversy about command shaped the construction of the Maginot Line and also the nature of the forts themselves. Both of these conflicts will resonate in what I'm about to talk about. So let's look at it chronologically. The first point to make is that building the Maginot Line was not the reflux of a nation traumatized by war. Discussion of how to defend the French frontier did immediately begin, but only as one of many studies of the lessons of the war, including tanks and aircraft, for instance. It's true that pacifism and anti-militarism were widespread in France, but so were they in Germany. Government policy at the time was not pacifism, but military domination of Germany. The Allies occupied part of the Rhineland until 1930, and in 1923, they occupied the industrial Ruhr to force payment of reparations. If war did happen, the plan was to cut Germany in two with the help of Czechoslovakia. When in 1925, 6 years after the end of war, a committee was at last set up to fortification, it declared, I quote, "Organisation of the defence of the territory is only one branch of the organisation of national defence and not the most important. It was subordinate to the restructure of the army, industrial mobilisation and the protection of communications with France's North African Empire." Now, but serious discussion of fortification began only in 1926, after Pétain, who was now head of the army, returned from suppressing rebellion in Morocco, underlines the primacy of empire and also that France was far from pacifist. By then, the policy of dominating Germany had failed, however. Henceforth, governments turned to reconciliation with Germany within a framework of economic cooperation, treaty obligations, and disarmament. Ultimately, a policy which, taken up again after the Second World War, led to the European Union. Disarmament, incidentally, meant outlawing offensive weapons, not outlawing all weapons. Now, the League of Nations defined fortification as defensive. Now, fortification began to appear even more necessary because the Versailles Treaty stipulated that if Germany cooperated with the peace treaty, the Allies would leave the occupied territories early. The Rhineland would remain demilitarized thereafter, but its buffer value was reduced. But discussion of fortification nevertheless dragged on for 4 more years. It's proved hard to agree what, if anything, to build. To cut a long story short, the Army's working group proposed a line of artillery forts, so-called gros ouvrages, big works, close to the frontier. They were meant to facilitate maneuver, so they included gaps to channel the enemy. The Belgian frontier was left unfortified in the expectation that maneuver would happen there, and the committee stated clearly that the best French troops would intervene in Belgium. Pétain, however, imposed the construction of permanent fortifications. He opposed the committee's report and advocated simply stocking trenching equipment, barbed wire, and equipment for constructing blockhouses on the frontier, ready for use when war broke out. He enjoyed the backing of influential left-wing politicians and many army officers. Among the politicians was, I've tried to avoid too many names, but Edouard Daladier, a left-wing politician, a veteran of the infantry, future defense minister and prime minister. Now, ultimately, the plan for large artillery forts on the frontier itself prevailed. So why? The first reason is that senior officers especially favoured them because they allowed commanders directly to control the troops, whereas field works and small blockhouses dispersed them. These artillery forts were organised according to the principles of the sciences of organisation, and the plans were approved at a time when enthusiasm for this managerial science was at a peak. commanders were to be all-powerful. They were likened to factory managers and warship captains. And in fact, naval officers helped design the command and manning systems on what were often called these great sunken battleships. The troops in the forts many of them were professionals, many were technically trained. Ordinary troops, the equivalent of manual laborers, I guess, as in the factory, learned simple operations by rote, and they were not expected to use their initiative. Large forts also allowed the conditions of the troops to be improved. And that was another of the objectives of the sciences of organization. Notably, they separated working from living space. So the barracks were in the rear, near the entrance blocks, deep underground, and they were separated by long galleries from the fighting blocks so that they were protected from bombardment. Now, this paralleled contemporary plans in cities to build comfortable lodgings for the working classes separately from insalubrious factory districts, in order to cut out the root causes of communism. The army also built, close to the fortifications, new modern barracks. Now, a second reason for choosing these large forts and for siting them close to the border was that the army and politicians alike were horrified by the rise of autonomism in Alsace-Lorraine, where the fortifications were sited. Now, this province, Alsace-Lorraine, had been lost to the Germans in 1871, thanks to defeat. The Germans had taken it because the inhabitants were largely German-speaking. It was recovered, thanks to victory in 1918, by the French. But the French government alienated the population by imposing French in education, administration, and the courts. An autonomist movement emerged, and in 1928, the government arrested and prosecuted its leaders. Now, the right-hand map here shows that the fortifications, which are closest to the border there, are positioned on the German-speaking side of the language line, which divides French from German speakers, which you can see there if you can see my cursor. I hope you can. Now, most of the Alsatians and Lorrainers had no desire to rejoin the Reich. But some did, and the grey dots show the sections of a pro-Nazi organization called the Jungmannschaft, a youth group, in other words. It was strongest in the rear of the fortified zones, where it was necessary for the army to recruit reserves to man the fortifications. Now, the desire to counter autonomism affected the positioning of the fortifications. On the left, you will see Pétain's rejected proposal for defence in depth. He envisaged only warning posts and destructions on the frontier. Second lines on the pre-1914 German positions on their old border at Metz, Belfort, Metz and Mutzig, sorry. And a third line on the old French fortifications on their side of their old border at Verdun and elsewhere. Now, in the Supreme War Council, General Boishu, who was then commander in Alsace, remarked that Pétain's proposal would lose Alsace. He was well aware of the difficulties in the province, Boishu was, for he reported in another report that there were daily incidents there between patrols and local inhabitants. And remember that in the Great War, Pétain had been criticised for abandoning national territory. So large permanent forts were chosen, that's the secondary reason, on the frontier itself, because they defended the whole province, and they symbolised the power of the French state and the army much better than Pétain's plan to stop trenching equipment there. Now, to sum up so far, the choice of constructing these large artillery fronts was at once military, social, and political. To fight communist anti-militarism, Alsace-Lorraine autonomism, the unifying principle was command, symbolised here in the bottom right photograph by the passing down of orders in the foreground and by the soldier in the background, who is an extension of the machine. Furthermore, the Maginot Line was designed at a time of great faith in advanced technology, symbolised here by the electric train. The Committee for Organisation of the Fortified Regions, an autonomous organisation, was the guardian of these modernist organisationalist principles. Now, inevitably, reality never matched ambition. The Maginot Line was a hubristic project, intrinsically unrealisable. There was much opposition to the committee, the Corf, and to defensive principles themselves, to the point that by 1939, French doctrine was highly polarised. So, first problem was that living conditions were at best mixed. The military engineers overestimated their ability to control, or to organise, as they put it, the natural environment. They believed that fortification could, as one officer put it, perfect nature where it was defective. As one general put, in the book, I discuss the mixed results of the Army's attempts to incorporate modified rivers and forests into the defensive system. But here, what matters is the problem of controlling the movement of air and water within the forts themselves. Because in warm summer weather, air from outside condensed in the cooler combat blocks. Meanwhile, especially if the doors weren't closed, steam from the kitchens and soiled air from the latrines rose from below. That happened all year round. The forts weren't constructed in the water table, unlike the Führer bunker in Berlin, but underground springs seep through masonry walls in the galleries. There was insufficient money to concrete or even render all of them. A journalist described a sort of fog in the galleries of one fort and puddles on the floor. Breathing was difficult, especially when the air pumps were turned off. The engineers installed central heating in sleeping quarters, but conditions were never good, certainly not for long-term occupation. Even in the relatively short periods of occupation in peacetime, troops complained of a condition they called bétonite, concretitis, a state of low-level depression and lethargy. Now, the picture wasn't all bad. The army also built numerous modern barracks in the middle and right-hand picture there. They were a huge improvement on what General called the dark holes of existing facilities. They included modern kitchens close to the refectories so that food was served hot, central heating, double glazing, triple glazing, etc. But troops felt that they spent too little in them. Usually they were away on exercise, constructing and manning small blockhouses. Now, not only were conditions in these works, which you can see on the left there, extremely uncomfortable in the harsh eastern climate, but commanders complained that the troops were far too dispersed to command effectively. The fortifications had not secured hierarchical command. Even more so because the army had to rely on locally recruited troops who often did not speak good French. The fortifications had to be capable of instant response to a surprise attack. They therefore had to rely on locally recruited reserves, able to reinforce the fortifications at a moment's notice. The older they were, the more likely they were to speak only German and German dialects. The youngest had done some French schooling, sort of. The oldest among them might even have fought for Germany in the previous war. The civilian Alsace-Lorraine population, autonomist or not, saw fortification as undermining the province's role as a bridge between France and Germany. They resented the expropriation of farmland, the multiple restrictions around the fortifications. There were many brawls between interior French, as they called them, soldiers and Alsace-Lorrainers, soldiers and civilians. The French regarded Alsace-Lorrainers as German when they used the polite term. Pro-autonomist or not, Alsace-Lorrainers were offended by attacks on their language, and none of them liked being called Boche. Although Alsace-Lorrainers rarely sympathized with Germany, the army saw all German speakers as potential spies. Thanks to the army's fear of espionage, the laws were tightened. In 1934, espionage was the equivalent of a misdemeanor tried in lower courts. By 1939, it was a capital crime tried in military tribunals without the usual legal guarantees. And the great majority of espionage cases did concern the Maginot Line. Espionage wasn't a myth. Now, another obstacle to the ideal of hierarchical command was that the political and military opponents of these large forts and of the Corf never disarmed. And even before fortifications were complete, they gained the upper hand. In 1932, the left won parliamentary elections. They brought to power men such as the previously mentioned Daladier, who'd always rejected large artillery forts in favour of field fortifications. Moreover, he wanted a continuous line from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. As War Minister in 1933, he ensured that no more artillery forts were planned, and he drew up a scheme to divide the whole frontier into fortified and sectors with permanent fortification and defensive sectors with field fortification. Now, this wasn't a case of politicians against soldiers, because in 1934, Marshal Pétain became War Minister, and he implemented enthusiastically Daladier's proposals. Another source of opposition to the Corf and the large forts were senior officers whose task it was to command corps in wartime. They also preferred field fortification, which they could construct and position as they wished prior to and during a battle. They'd long resented the fact that the Corf and the fortified sectors were organisationally independent of them. Senior and junior infantry officers were also resentful of what they saw as the abstract, scientific, unrealistic systems of the engineers who dominated the Corf. They prized instead their own intuitive understanding of the terrain, their judgment. Many of them, and this is one of my surprising discoveries, turned to the pseudoscience of radiesthesia, now forgotten largely, a sort of divining which involved using pendulums to detect troop movements. Now, that too is another story, evoked here only to show the nature of opposition to the Corf. But in 1935, this opposition prevailed. The Corf was wound up. Over the next years, field fortifications were incrementally constructed along the whole border. To reiterate, all these problems undermined the Maginot Line architect's objective of reinforcing central and hierarchical command. Now, fortification service was also very unpopular in the army. Historically, fortification service was the lot of elderly officers ending their careers peacefully. The army attempted to counter this perception by depicting the new fortifications as troops as an elite. They were better paid, they were given the new khaki uniforms, and yet only new lieutenants who'd graduated bottom of the class at military school and thus could not choose their deployments were sent to the fortifications. Others were sent for crimes against honour, indebtedness, or public drunkenness in uniform. Ultimately, the army forced officers to serve there, and they never liked it. They preferred postings in Paris to service in remote rural areas inhabited by poor German speakers where there were no high schools for their children. They preferred units, furthermore, that prized manoeuvre, such as the light and alpine infantry. They criticised what one officer called the eternally defensive character of the fortifications. There was no Maginot Line mentality in the army. The story is one of polarisation. In 1931, as construction of the Maginot Line began, Maxime Weygand succeeded Pétain as vice president of the Supreme War Council and thus commander-in-chief when war broke out. Maurice Gamelin succeeded him in 1935. Both of them were committed to manoeuvre. As the fortifications were completed and manned, they initiated a different development, the modernisation of the infantry. From 1943, the formation of the 1st Light Armoured Division, resembling but preceding the Panzer divisions. Their revision of the regulations in 1936-8 made more room for initiative and included a new section on the use of armoured divisions, precisely that used in Belgium in 1940. These revisions, it's important to note, were not just imposed from above or the work of a minority, they were the product of long debates in the military press, which involved junior as well as senior officers. They were made possible also, new strategies were made possible by the appearance of new weapons, high velocity anti-tank guns, track supply vehicles, 60 and 81mm mortars, better light machine guns, faster tanks, aircraft and motorcycles. Now, I don't want to suggest that on the eve of war, the army had abandoned defence for offence and manoeuvre. I'll return to my starting point and draw things together. Rather, the picture was one of polarisation and politicisation. On the one side were Gamelan's increasingly ambitious plans for intervention in Belgium and the Netherlands, not to speak of Switzerland, the Arctic Circle and the Caucasus, but again, that's another story. But in Belgium, at least, these plans were made possible by the formation of the armoured and motorised infantry divisions and the reform of the regulations. Now, the French plan, if the Germans did not attack him first in Belgium, was to attack Germany through its own fortifications on their border. On the other side of French polarisation stood those committed to appeasement of Hitler, who argued that since German expansion in Eastern Europe did not concern France, the country should withdraw behind the Maginot Line and retreat into the empire and defend itself only if attacked, an eventuality it persisted in believing unlikely. The tensions in the army are revealed in a question discussed at the outset. Senior commanders were well aware that the fortifications were vastly overmanned and that too many troops were immobilized in static regiments. Plans were drawn up to convert these fortification regiments into mobile field units once mobilization was complete. But the fortifications have become a vast, ponderous bureaucracy, hungry for resources and dedicated to its own reproduction. They presented this measure from happening in 1939 to 40, when Gamelin attempted to implement it. Now, secondly, at the head of the military appeasers was Marshal Pétain, the aged Marshal Pétain. In 1939, he wrote a notorious and approving preface to a book called Is an Invasion Still Possible? The book concluded that it was not, and it's often been cited as evidence of a complacent Maginot mentality. But in fact, the preface warns that offensive doctrine was returning. The preface is not evidence of universal Maginot mentality, but of polarization and Pétain's fear of Gamelin's plans for ambitious advance into Belgium. Now, this polarization then is the background to Georges' opposition to Gamelin's plan to enter Belgium and the Netherlands, which turned out so disastrously and which I've tried to put into context. But the purpose of the book isn't to retell the story of the battles in the north, which I deal with in the book very quickly, but to tell the story of the Maginot Line. Now, just a quick glance forward. Once the Battle of Dunkirk was over and the evacuation of French and British troops, the Germans assaulted new French lines on the Somme and Aisne rivers. They broke through on the Aisne River on the 10th of June. They headed south and encircled the Maginot Line from the rear. Its troops became pawns in a battle over whether to conclude an armistice, as Pétain and Weygand advocated, or to fight on with the British Empire and the French Empire and hopefully American support, as General de Gaulle and certain politicians wished. Hitler, meanwhile, was keen to capture the famous Maginot Line, with which he was somewhat obsessed. Although little more than a footnote in histories of 1940, the Maginot Line became the site of perhaps the biggest encirclement battle of the war after Kiev in 1941, well, before Kiev in 1941. In this battle, all of the issues I discussed counted. But if you want to know what happened, I'm afraid you'll have to read the book. So thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Kevin. That was great. I know we have a number of questions in the queue. Mark, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question, and then we'll go to just trying to I guess, yeah, and then we'll go to Mike. So Mark, why don't you unmute your line? Mark?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kevin. This was a great presentation, and I already have your book queued up in Audible as my next book. My question to you is, there was, after the Germans had attacked Poland, there was really a lack of movement or initiative on the part of the French military, except for one very minor incursion that I think went in, 2 kilometers or 4 kilometers or something like that. Could you explain the lack of the initiative, a lack of trying to save Poland while Germany was, concentrated in the east, and why did that small little offensive fail?
Well, I would say that the French plans towards Poland were somewhat cynical. Their assumption was that they could only restore Poland after the war and that they couldn't save them. The Gamelin earlier in 1931 had made quite extravagant promises to Poland of what his offensive would do, but really he had no intention of doing anything very serious. And his orders, which are preserved in the archives, show that it was not a serious offensive. Gamelin, the offensive went through the gap on the Maginot Line. If I can get back to the beginning, in that, if you can see, it kind of went up there roughly. Uh, they approached the German fortifications and did very little. As soon as Gamelin heard that German troops were moving towards the west in order to confront it, he scaled the offensive down and used it as an excuse to scale it down, although the ostensible purpose was to relieve pressure on the Poles. The following period, the weather was very, very bad, which made action of any sort pretty difficult. But the French were pretty constrained because attacking the Maginot, they had very few options. Attacking the German fortifications, which were now much, much stronger than they had been in 1938 when they might have had a chance, required equipment and so on, which they didn't think they would have until 1941. The Germans concluded the same actually for attacking the Maginot Line. So the French option was to they couldn't invade Belgium themselves politically. They did consider going into Belgium uninvited, but ultimately that was politically not possible for the Allies. So they had to await the German attack. But they got increasingly, there was increasing discontent at inaction. And this is why the French planned various actions, which turned out to be ill-advised if they'd happened. That was a plan to bomb Russian oil refineries in the Caucasus. At Baku, and also, I'm sure you know, the disastrous intervention in Norway, where the Allies laid mines there, but they didn't enter Norway. The Germans went first, and it was, of course, a disaster. So there were various plans and much pressure for action. And that pressure for action is one of the reasons, actually, why Gamelin chose such an ambitious advance into the Netherlands, because he was under attack for doing nothing. So, and he feared that he was going to be replaced by Georges. And so, what better way to prove that you were a man of action than engage in a reckless maneuver?
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes, yes, great talk. It's good to have somewhat of a wealth perspective on this. Just a little humor there. The questions are, it seems to me that the problem here with the French strategy and policy seems to be that there was a split, and I think you were alluding to this, that it was a lack of commitment, shall we say, to one policy or the other, so that you didn't really have a solid fully committed, any one solid, fully committed policy. And I was wondering if that was one of the causes for the failure of the French defense doctrine. Also, I was wondering what the how much the British and the Germans were aware of what was going on with these disputes within the French military and political realm, and what their reactions and opinions and actions actually concerning that were, if that makes sense.
Yeah, those are good questions. I think you're absolutely right on the first question, and they didn't totally commit to one strategy or the other. And I think the answer to that partly lies in the answer to the second question is, you say, what did they know of German intentions? Well, they always thought that an attack through Belgium was most likely, but they were never sure. And the German troops were kind of lined up here, but the French never could work out whether they were pointing downwards towards the Maginot Line or westwards into central Belgium. So, or even into the Netherlands. So that was their problem. And they never guessed the Ardennes strategy. And that is a major failure of intelligence. And I have to say that the British contribution to all of this was, to be honest, aside from in the air, pretty pathetic.
Right, but were they aware of what was going on, both the British and the Germans, of these disputes within the French military?
Oh yes, the British were aware of disputes in the French military. Yes, they absolutely were. I do quote, in fact, at one point, the British Chief of Staff, whose name's just gone out of my head, who said, "I've just seen Gamelin. He thinks he's for the high jump if he doesn't act soon." So they were absolutely aware of these disputes. They were alarmed by the plans, I think, to advance some of Gamelin's plans. They didn't object to the plan to go to Breda, but they were alarmed by some of Gamelin's other plans, which included things like going right up to the German border with Belgium, for example. So they were a bit alarmed, but I mean, the British did accept French leadership, really. Their ground forces were fairly puny compared to the Germans, compared to the French. Yes, they absolutely were aware.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mike. We'll take one more from Paul, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question. Paul, are you able to unmute your line?
I think Paul is muted.
Yeah, I think technical difficulties. Well, there's one or two in the queue here. Maybe we can go to them and see if we can come back to Paul. One is asking, really enjoyed your book. Could you talk about the impact of Le Corbusier's architecture on the design of the Maginot Line?
Yeah. Now, I'm very happy to have a question on that. I think because one of the things that interests me is that the Maginot Line, to me, was constructed at Le Corbusier was a kind of marginal figure in many ways, but his ideas did resonate in military circles, partly because of common use of concrete, because the army was interested in industrial scale production. The army was one of the few things that ever constructed anything in interwar France. But Le Corbusier's is most known for skyscrapers and light-looking, airy-looking residential dwellings. But he was also interested in urban planning. And he had these plans for Paris, which divided the city up into functional zones for offices, zones for factories, some zones for bourgeois residences and for working class residences, the equivalent of the projects, I guess. And those ideas were pretty influential, much more widely, and also he was very interested in these so-called sciences of organization. And he said, he was a great admirer of Taylor, the American. So
Yeah.
yes, but one of my arguments is that there was a brief moment of prosperity in the late 1920s when the Maginot Line was conceived in the midst of this enthusiasm for modernism, for Le Corbusier and that kind of thing, but it didn't last.
Yeah, and I think in your book you talk about it was somewhat forward-looking in terms of having ovens,
Yeah,
stoves,
yeah, absolutely.
even a subway was planned at one point.
Yeah. There was, well, there were underground railways within the forts themselves.
Yep.
There were kilometers and kilometers of galleries in some of them.
Yeah, that's
The big forts. Not all the forts were built on that kind of grand scale. Many of them were rather weaker.
Paul, I see your lines unmuted. If you want to ask your question.
Yes, I'm back. Sorry about that. Hi, Kevin. Paul Yankowski here. I read the book and enjoyed it very much, and I likewise the talk. I wanted to ask if you could say something more about polarization and politicization in the army. I understand indeed that the Maginot Line, especially after 1936, could appeal to a certain right,
Yeah,
which saw it as the very least provocative to Hitler.
yeah,
While the new armored divisions, the DLMs, might appeal to those who wanted to take the fight to the Germans. I'm puzzled by this, even though it's true, because on the other hand, those new offensive weapons or formations were also attacked by the left as being reactionary.
yeah.
And the whole thing seems extremely muddled to me, and I was wondering if you could help clear that up.
Well, the left's views evolved. They did sometimes attack armored divisions as reactionary, but from 1936 they really changed their minds. Insofar as any of them were really interested in weaponry. To be honest, that's one of the things I've found. I mean, the left-wing press hardly ever mentions weaponry.
Yes.
Sometimes the radical socialists did, but the communists only mentioned the Red Army. So the polarization within the army, I would say that the polarization began in the 1930s on the fringes of the army and in political spheres, and then developed within the army much more explicitly during the Phoney War. In the 1930s, in the late 1930s, the left had they'd been converted largely to military resistance, and the Popular Front had introduced its weaponry program. At that point, Léon Blum met de Gaulle and talked about armored divisions with him, and he left military policy basically to Daladier, who well, it's very difficult to know where Daladier stood as well, because on the one hand, he kind of talked about continuous fortifications from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. But on the other hand, he didn't spend very much money on it. Virtually nothing was spent on fortifications after 1936.
Yes.
And the money went on planes rather disastrously and on tanks with more limited success. But I would say that the polarization began in political, and it's quite obvious in the newspapers that people saying, we've got to act, we need maneuver. When the Phoney War began, people began to say, well, in fact, time is not with us, so we need to act. And they thought that because the Germans had this alliance with the Soviet Union, the previous French strategy of a long war wasn't going to work. And they thought that well, ultimately the Germans would outproduce them, and a long war did not serve the French. So that was the background to that polarization.
Yeah.
And so the choice. And during the war itself, appeasers kept relatively quiet. Many of them were wise after the event, but the mood went either towards, well, this war is a mistake in a very small minority, or we need action of some sort. And the division really, in that sense, was whether we should act in Norway and Baku, or whether we should save our powder for the coming German invasion of Belgium. So it is confused. You're absolutely right.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Great question. That concludes our talk for today. Thank you to our speaker for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, the book is The Maginot Line, A New History by Kevin Passmore. Please join us next Saturday, May 2nd at 1 p.m. when historian Tobias Straumann will discuss his book, Out of Hitler's Shadow, which discusses the crucial decisions regarding reparations after World War II to reparations for the German and their impact on the European and German 20th century economic miracle. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you at our next talk. Thank you very much, Kevin. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.